Hello, everybody, and welcome to our last refugee program seminar for the semester. So today we have the pleasure of having Professor Sandra Rozo, who is going to be talking about the Brothers of Invaders and how crisis-driven migrants shape voting behavior. Professor Rozo is a development and labor economist, and she works at the Marshall School of Business at the University of Southern California. And her work focuses on firm decision, forced migration, diversity, and crime. So please join me welcoming Professor Rozo for the seminar.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very excited to be here. This is a wonderful program, and I am very honored for the invitation. So the paper that I will present today is a paper that, in a nutshell, to kind of give you an overview of what I will be talking about, it evaluates the effects that Venezuelan migration has had on voting behaviors. And this is going to be joint work with Juan Vargas from Universidad Rosario. So before I begin, I just wanted to kind of bring this quote from The Economist. It was published in 2018 to kind of motivate what I will be talking about. So it says, the fear of immigration is poisoning Western politics. Donald Trump owes his job to it, and Brexit would not be happening without it. Strident nationalists wielded power in Italy, Hungary, Poland, and Austria, and have gained influence elsewhere. So basically, a couple of years ago, there was already this idea that migration, in many cases, is used as a weapon in the political arena. And so this is one of the ideas that we want to explore in this paper. So just to motivate why we think this is relevant, I wanted to talk a little bit about bring forced displacement to context. So forced displacement has been increasing dramatically. As of 2019, we have almost 80 million people who have been forcibly displaced. And just to kind of give you, like a context, or put more context into this number, this is the size of almost 2 California. So we're talking about a very large number of individuals here. And most of the migrants are hosted in developing nations, which is not surprising because those are the neighbors of other conflict countries. So why do we think that forced migrants deserve a different analysis? So forced migration has very different characteristics than economic migration. So for one, forced migrants tend to arrive in very large numbers. They are also going through very vulnerable journeys, and they arrive with no assets at all, or very few assets. Typically, forced migrants tend to be disproportionately represented by women and children. And lastly, they face large uncertainty. So when they are making their decisions, they don't have a current clear situation of whether they will be allowed to stay, or if they will be moving again or going back. And for that, the decisions that they make might be very different from the ones made by an economic migrant. So to kind of tell you a little bit of what is known about the impacts that forced migration, or migration in general, has had on voting behaviors, there has been very, let's say, robust recent work on trying to measure what are the impacts that higher forced migration has had on the support for right-wing ideologies and political participation. And in general, most of these papers are focused on developed countries, and they show that when the forced migration inflows increase, there is a surge, or right-wing support increases. And there is kind of mixed evidence onto what happens with voters' turnout. Some papers find this positive, and some papers find that is negative. So what are we going to do in this paper? What we're going to do is first try to see if this is true also for a developing country. So what happens in a developing country when you have a large surge of forced migration? What happens with voting behaviors? And then we're going to explore 3 different mechanisms. So one of them is what we call the socioeconomic mechanism, which is basically trying to see whether the economic impacts that forced migration might be having might be driving these voting effects, or these political effects that we observe. And there is a couple more, which are cultural and electoral manipulation, that I will explain in a second exactly how they are defined. So although there is a lot of evidence on trying to measure how forced migration impacts voting behaviors, especially for the northern countries of the world, the US, Europe, there is quite a debate on what is driving this mechanism. So as I mentioned earlier, there's probably three main mechanisms that we're going to explore in this paper. One of it is what we call the socioeconomic hypothesis, or the economic hypothesis, which says basically that migrants react in their voting behaviors to migration because migration creates economic effects, which could be positive or negative. In general, we're pointing to negative effects. That's what most of the papers actually find. For example, migration might be increasing crime, or migration might reduce job opportunities for locals, and this is why they basically react with more antipathy towards migration. Another different hypothesis is that migration basically creates this in-group and out-group tensions in a way such that the nationals of a country feel threatened in their cultural views relative to the migration or the migrants that are coming in. And so that's another hypothesis. This one, however, we're only going to touch on tangentially, because it's really hard to prove that this is actually driving our effects. And the last one, which I think is our main contribution and which we think is pretty new, is that in many contexts, political parties use the migration, for example, forced migration inflows, to associate that migration with their competing parties' electoral platform in a way such that they demonize the other parties. So let me just kind of explain better. For example, in Colombia, what we see is that the right-wing parties basically associated the Venezuelan migration with the Venezuelan regime and say, if you vote for the left, you are going to become Venezuela. And that's what we called electoral manipulation. So we're going to explore whether that is actually affecting the effects that we observe. So how is this presentation going to be structured? I'm going to structure it in 5 parts. So first, I will briefly talk about the Venezuelan context for those of you who are not familiar with it. And then I'll talk a little bit about the data, empirical strategy, the results, the general results of the impacts of forced migration on voting behaviors. And then I will talk a little bit about the mechanisms. So here is, let's say, a short summary of the share of Venezuelan inflows as a percentage of the Colombian population. So just kind of give you an overview how things have been going on in Colombia. So the Venezuelan crisis arguably began with the election of Hugo Chavez in 1988. But it is only until 2016, or if you will, 2010, when you see an explosion of inflows of Venezuelans to Colombia. So what happened? Why is this happening? So in 1998, or before this, let me just kind of tell you a little bit of what Venezuela was before this crisis began. Venezuela was a very prosperous country. So I lived in Colombia. I am Colombian, and I lived in Colombia for more than 20 years. And I remember very clearly that a lot of my family and friends will go to Venezuela to work in the oil companies. Technology was brought from Venezuela. So in our view, a lot of Colombians migrate to leave Venezuela because it had better social safety nets, better education. It was a very prosperous country. However, in 1998, Hugo Chavez was elected president, and he was a socialist populist leader, which introduced a lot of constitutional amendments, expropriations of private property, and nationalizations. And he mainly used the oil rents to fund all his populism. In 2013, Nicolás Maduro was appointed as his successor, and he strengthened all of these policies, and the crisis actually worsened there because he was not as fortunate as Chavez, and oil rents actually dropped. The price of oil dropped, and the US also introduced very drastic economic sanctions. So kind of to give you a little bit of an overview of how drastic this crisis is, between 1998 and 2018, there was a contraction of 50% of the Venezuelan GDP. Unemployment is approximately 40% of the total labor force of that country. Poverty rate is rampant, almost 90%. There are shortages of food and basic services. Insecurity is very high, and there is a very large repression to the opposition, to the Maduro's government. So not surprisingly, there has been a very large surge of migration outside of Venezuela to all of Latin America. So the map that I am showing you on the right is showing you the intensity of migration flow. So the darker the color, the more inflows that country has received. So Colombia is the primary recipient of Venezuelan migration flows, which by 2019, according to the UN Refugee Agency, were reaching 4.5 million individuals. And of those 4.5 million, 1.8 are registered to be living in Colombia to stay. So one important kind of disclaimer about this data is that typically this data is going to be underrepresentation of the real amount of migrants that you would see, because of course there's not a very strong control of the borders, of the international borders, and a lot of migrants are afraid to be registered because they don't want to be deported or actually identified by authorities. So what are we going to do? So basically, we're going to use data from the Electoral Agency in Colombia in two main outcomes. One is what we call political participation or voters turnout. And the other one is the political ideology of each of the candidates that are aspiring to be mayor or presidents in the country. So we're going to use data between 1995, municipal annual data between 1995 and 2018. And we're going to use data for 6 first-round presidential elections and 5 second-round presidential elections and 6 major elections. So what is, let's say, a very hard work that we had to do was first in identifying the political party of each of the candidates that posted for any of these elections that wanted to be elected, and then classifying each of these candidates on left, center, or right, according to their own declarations or by actually checking their government plan or their campaign plan and classifying them according to these views. And so we're going to kind of see the impacts that forced migration had on voters turnout and then on the share of votes to each of these orientations, right, center, and left. Forced migration data is going to come from the Colombian Statistical Agency, and then our construction of, let's say, of primary source of identification is going to come from the population censuses of 1993 and 2005. And this is a large set of controls that we're going to use. I am going to skip this slide for now for time efficiency. So when we want to estimate the impacts that forced migration, Venezuelan migration, has had on voting behaviors, we face this challenge that, of course, migration is not random. So migrants vote with their feet, and they tend to move to municipalities that, for example, are more prosperous, where they feel safer, that presumably are more open to migrants, and that is correlated with voting behaviors. So what we're going to do is basically exploit longitudinal variation, and we're going to exploit 2 sources of variation. One is we're going to use cross-sectional variation coming from the share of Venezuelans who arrived before the beginning of the crisis to Colombia. And this is the municipal level with the early population censuses. And the temporal variation is basically going to come from the overall number of individuals that are arriving from Venezuela to Colombia. So the interaction of these 2 effects is basically going to be what we call the predicted Venezuelan inflows. It is going to try to tell us how many migrants we expect to see in each of the municipalities in Colombia. Unfortunately, this is not going to be an IV strategy, or fortunately, as how you see instrumental variables, but this is going to be more of a reduced form estimation because there's no data, actual data at the municipal level on how many Venezuelans live in each municipality. And what is the assumption that we're going to actually be using here is basically that migrants tend to move disproportionately to those areas where they have pre-existing networks, friends, family. And of course, this is a very traditional instrument used or proxy for migration flows used in the migration literature. So here is the specification form more particularly. So Y, MDT are going to be the political outcomes that we're examining at the municipal level. M stands for municipality, D for department, and T is going to be the election year. And then we're going to try to see the impacts that our measure of predicted Venezuelan inflows has had on the political outcomes. And this is coming from the instrument that I just explained, or the variable that we created. And we're going to control for a lot of covariates to kind of clean these confounders that may be affecting the estimates of the theta here that we want to identify. One of them is we're going to include, as much as we can, baseline covariates at the municipality level interacted with year dummies. The idea here is basically to see or clean all of these stories that may be confounding the impacts of Venezuelan migration and are correlated, presumably, with our outcomes. We're going to include interactions of department trends and year trends or election year trends. And we're going to include fixed effects by election year and municipality. So here is how we constructed specifically the measure of predicted Venezuelan inflows. So it's going to be corresponding to the interaction of the cumulative Venezuelan inflow to Colombia, the overall national inflows. This is like, let's say, the temporal variation interacted with the municipal variation of early Venezuelan settlements in Colombia. This is in 1993, which is the last population census before Chavez was elected in 1998. And we're going to just kind of scale this over the population observed in each municipality. So to show you a little bit of the validity of this variable in truly capturing the Venezuelan settlements at the municipality level, we did two exercises. One of them is basically using the predicted Venezuelan inflows, this proxy that we're going to use as for Venezuelan location, and the data that we have from the censuses to show that indeed Venezuelans are moving to those areas. So on your left, you have a map of Colombia divided by municipality in which we're illustrating the predicted Venezuelan inflows in 1993. And on your right, we cross that figure with circles that are larger for the inflows that arrived between 1993 and 2005. So in 2005, of Venezuelans, no? In 2005, we observe another population census. And when we have population census, we have the unique opportunity to truly verify where Venezuelans are located. So you can see that there is a large overlap between both variables and that actually the correlation is strong and significant. We did the same exercise, but with the last population censuses. So we have three censuses, 1993, 2005, and 2018 during our period of analysis. And the census of 2018, unfortunately, does not allow us, or we haven't gotten access to the specific nationality identifiers, but we know who's a foreigner. The good news is that of the whole share of foreigners in Colombia, approximately 90% are Venezuelans. So we basically also show a similar graph here in which we show our early settlements of Venezuelans in 1993 and the location of foreigners in 2018. And again, the correlation between both variables is very, very large. So when you use Bartik shift shared instruments like the one that we constructed, there has been kind of a very big surge of critiques towards this type of variable. So here I'm going to kind of talk about two main threats that might be affecting the validity of this variable. But we actually talk about more of them in our paper. So the first one is one brought by Goldsman and Pinkham, in which he basically says, for this, let's say, variables to be credible, what we need to show is that the share part is actually valid, that it satisfies the exogeneity assumption. And so what we're going to do to kind of address this is basically include a large set of covariates observed at baseline. And we're going to include here in our estimation controls for economic growth, measured as nightlight density, for homicides, for previous conflict, for share of agricultural GDP in the whole economy. So there is a very large set of covariates that we're going to include in order to kind of account for this bias, and we interact those with election dummies or year dummies to kind of non-parametrically control for variables that may be trending in time and driving biases in our estimates. And another big, let's say, critique to these instruments is that when migration flows are consistent and you're trying to use these instruments to identify the effects of migration, you are confounding short and long-term effects of migration when you run these estimates. And this is not going to be such a relevant concern because the migration from Venezuela and Colombia is a recent shock. It actually became endemic after 2016. And migration from Venezuela to Colombia, or in general from any country to Colombia, was negligible before that time. So actually, Colombia is a very close country internationally. So how do we execute our analysis to kind of guide you to what I will be talking about? We first evaluate the effects of forced migration on voting behaviors. That's the first thing I'm going to do. And then we're going to kind of evaluate each of the three hypotheses that I mentioned might be driving these effects. So first, we're going to see if is there evidence to kind of support the idea that there are economic effects driving these effects that we observe in voting behavior. So we're going to study the effects of migration on labor outcomes and on fiscal burden, because we think those are the two main channels or the two main things that are, let's say, beliefs that may be driving changes in voting behaviors in the individuals that live in Colombia. Then we're going to kind of discuss why we think the cultural hypothesis is not really a very strong candidate to explain what is going on in voting behaviors. And here we're not going to have any empirical strategy because there's not enough data at the municipal level to actually carry out this, evaluate this hypothesis. And then I'm going to kind of show you or talk a little bit about this electoral manipulation hypothesis, why we think it's happening, what is the anecdotal evidence existing supporting that, and we're going to also show you some empirical evidence that might support why we think this is also an important candidate for the effects that we observe. Okay.
Sandra, one question. So when you said that you're looking at the elections that they have, are these elections the municipal level or for mayor or for the president, or which elections are you
doing? Thank you, Maria Teresa. So this is a good question. So we're going to have 3 levels of elections. So this is all the municipal level. So it's going to correspond to the results of the election at the municipality level. But we're going to analyze the outcomes of the presidential election, first and second round, and the major elections. To kind of see whether they kind of translate across different types of elections. Those are the 3 levels that we're going to study. So let me kind of show you the results here. So panel A is going to show you the presidential elections for the first round. So basically, whether there was more, for example, total votes corresponds to voters turnout here. So is in a municipality, do we see that more people showed up to vote for the presidential elections on the second round and for the major elections? So the first column in each of these tables is, or if you want, the odd columns are going to show you the effects without including all of the controls for municipal socioeconomic confounders that may be affecting our estimates, and the even columns control for all of those. So here are kind of the overall interactions that were included. For example, conflict and violence includes a very large set of covariates that account for homicide rates, conflict, threats, robberies, and each of these group of outcomes is kind of accounting for each of these groups of different threats that we could have on our identification strategy. So the second or the even columns are the ones that we think are, or we view as our preferred estimates of the effects of Venezuelan migration. So what do we see? So in general, across all elections, we observe that when predicted Venezuelan inflows increase in standard deviations, the voter turnout increases. This is true for the first round, for the second round, and for major elections. So overall, we see people tend to go more and vote more. And what does that translate to in terms of support for left, center, and right-wing political orientation? What we see, which is very much in line with what we observe in other countries, is that higher predicted Venezuelan inflows are actually reflected in lower support towards left-wing political identities and more support from the right wing for the right wing. So basically, our composition of votes from the left to the right. And this is very robust across both presidential elections and for major elections. One thing to kind of point out is that for the major elections, we are not able to statistically capture a precise effect here, but this has to is related with the fact that the last major elections that we included here took place in 2015, before the real surge in Venezuelan migration took place. So in a new version of this paper, we're actually going to include the last major election that just recently took place, and that might kind of allow us to have more power to see if this becomes significant.
Sandra, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I'm not super familiar with the electoral system in Colombia. So could you tell me why the number of observations is so different between the different elections?
Yes, of course. So let's see. So for some, this is the main reason basically is that in general, there seems to be a lot more information for the presidential elections where we observe a lot more political participation, if you will. In general, we should observe kind of voting counts for all the municipalities of the country, but for some election years, there is no data available. And that's what probably would show the different number of observations. How it works is basically the presidential elections work in a way so that when candidates go and try to be elected for being a president, if one of them gets the majority plus 1 votes, then they are elected as president. If none of them gets this majority, then they go to a runoff. And the first 2 candidates, the ones that receive more votes, actually kind of compete in a second round. And whoever gets the majority of votes, that's going to be the winner across the whole country. And major elections are just elected through a simple majority rule. Whoever gets the more votes at the municipal level is going to win.
Okay, so the difference between the first row and the second row would be not every presidential election went to a runoff?
Exactly. Yes. That's exactly right. Mm-hmm. A lot of them. So actually, I think we have 6 first round and 5 second rounds in the period of analysis.
Got it. But otherwise, it's a balanced panel, so you have all the.
It should be there, but as I said, there is some municipalities that didn't report for some, but they are not a lot. But there are some municipalities that did not report voting outcomes.
Okay, thanks.
And the vote is every 4 years for the presidents, and for the mayors is the same every 4 years?
It is mostly 4, but at the beginning of the period there were some changes in the timing. So initially it was 3, and then for the rest of the period it was more or less 4. And this is why we have kind of a different number. So specifically we have let's see. Just quickly, we have 6 first round, 5 second round, and 6 major elections across this period, 1995 and 2018.
And do they vote at the same time for president and for mayors?
No, they don't. So there are other elections going on in Colombia, but we decided not to work on those because the classification of the parties becomes more complicated. A lot of, for example, congressional candidates did not have a very clear agenda that will allow us or enable us to kind of classify them as either center, left, or right. But they have conflicted policies that made it very hard for us to make a clear classification of their political orientation. And so that's why we decided just to stay with these 3 elections. All right. So in general, what we found is that whenever the predicted Venezuelan inflows increase in 1 standard deviation, we see across all of the elections that we examine larger political participation, lower support towards the left-wing political ideologies, and larger towards right-wing. And just to kind of give you an overview of how large these effects are, the mean support for the left for the first round presidential elections was 0.10. And the effect that we're observing when we increase our measure of predicted Venezuelan inflows in 1 standard deviation is a change. We observe a reduction of 0.9 percentage points. In other words, this is a 10% deviation from the mean support for left-wing political ideology. So these are large impacts. And it is important to kind of take into account that since the support for left is not that large in Colombia, we're talking about very, very important changes. So before I move on to talk a lot about the mechanisms, I wanted to kind of mention 2 robustness tests that we kind of run to test whether this was actually robust, these effects that I just showed you. So one was that
we have a question before you do that, which is if the right wing in Colombia has a strong anti-immigration platform.
Great question. Let me just kind of talk about this in a couple of slides. I am going to talk about this, but no, the short answer is no. We'll talk about that in a second. I will have a slide of that. So I don't want to lose a lot of time in this robustness test, but basically what we did is we had a lot of concerns about the fact that maybe the departments or the municipalities that were located in the border with Venezuela had a different behavior. Basically, they were more pro-migrant or less pro-migrant because they see or have more exposure to migrants. And so for that, what we did is we run our estimates excluding different departments of the country one at a time, and we run everything again, and we find very robust effects of everything that I've showed you. Another thing that we did is we say, okay, maybe this instrument or this variable is not a good proxy of Venezuelan migration, so let's use a different one. What if we use just distance to the main border crossing locations in the Colombian-Venezuelan border? And for that, we calculated the distance of each municipality to each of these border crossings, and we run everything again, and the results are very, very similar. In fact, we actually found that there is a large correlation between the variable that we're using and the distance to the border, so that the results are also very, very similar. Okay, so now we're going to move on to try to see what could be driving this effect. So remember, there are three possible mechanisms that we wanted to explore, and one is maybe this is just economic effects, right? Maybe this is just migrants are having a negative impact on, for example, labor outcomes, and we want to see whether there is some evidence of that truly happening. So the first thing is exactly that, checking whether Venezuelan migration has affected outcomes in the formal or informal sector. And for that, what we use are the labor force surveys in Colombia. And we basically tested the main labor outcomes: hours work, wages, and unemployment in the formal and informal sector. And here I am showing you the results. It's a very similar identification strategy. And what we see overwhelmingly is that whenever there, or in the municipalities where there is a larger inflow of Venezuelan migrants, individuals, Colombian nationals are working more, and they have a larger unemployment rates. And we also see some, let's say, suggestive evidence that wages are dropping, but it's not enough to identify a statistically significant effect. So this is somehow saying, okay, yes, there is something on the economic environment that might be driving voting behaviors. And then we said, okay, what else could be a main important economic effect that migrants could have that may be driving voting decisions? And we thought another very important one was a fiscal burden. So in the sense that maybe individuals are paying more taxes, or the government is sending more money to those regions that are actually receiving more migrants. And for that, we use municipal data on tax income per capita and the government transfers from the central government to the municipalities. And we see evidence of both. So we do see that it seems that at a per capita level, individuals are actually paying more taxes, and also the central government is sending more money to these municipalities that are receiving more migrants. And so overall, these two results kind of give us a very good understanding that there is something going on in the economic dimension that might be driving voting effects. So we cannot discourage or discard this hypothesis, this socioeconomic hypothesis, that there is something here, at least in Colombia. So the second hypothesis was the cultural hypothesis, which is very much in line with the question that I just received from Maria Teresa, saying, is it true that right-wing ideologies are anti-immigrant? And so for this part of the analysis, we're not going to be able to offer an empirical a statistical analysis, but we will kind of talk to you why we think, or try to convince you why we think this is not the main driver. So the first thing is that no, right-wing ideologies in Colombia are not typically anti-immigrant. So in fact, the current president of Colombia, Iván Duque, is a very pro-immigrant president. So he has been supporting a very large amnesty that has regularized Venezuelan migrants. He has also given them a very generous access to social safety nets, and recently to health coverage, unlimited health coverage to any migrant in Colombia. And I think this is an important thing to take into account, because when we are kind of bringing conclusions from the north to the south, we cannot translate these right and left-wing orientations in the same way. So each country has their different views or different political, let's say, agendas identifying left and right. And in Colombia, particularly, right-wing ideologies are not anti-immigrant. Another important thing to kind of mention here of why we do not think this cultural hypothesis could be driving our effects is that Colombia and Venezuela are culturally very similar. So Colombians and Venezuelans speak Spanish, and we were part of the same country up until 1831. The very large, vast majority of Colombians and Venezuelans have the same religion, eat similar foods. And so for all of these reasons, it's really hard to envision that the voting behaviors, the changing voting behaviors are actually driven by a cultural, let's say, xenophobic reaction. But of course, this is not something that we can prove statistically. And so the last mechanism that we wanted to kind of bring forth is what we call the electoral manipulation hypothesis. And again, this is this idea that the right might be using the migration presence or the large migration flows to say, if you vote for the left, we are going to become the country who actually expelled all of these migrants, right? Or in other words, the right saying, we're going to become Venezuela if you vote for the left. And I am showing you just here some anecdotal evidence of banners posted all across the country in which there were different messages suggesting this idea, saying, for example, I don't want to live as a Venezuelan. If you don't want to live as a Venezuelan, vote for Duque, which was a right-wing president candidate.
So, Sandra,
vote so that Colombia, sorry.
Sorry, this is Mushfiq, if I can just interrupt. I'm just confused by the word manipulation, because manipulation sounds a lot stronger than a particular messaging, right? Manipulation sounds like almost like cheating. That's not what you mean. You just mean that they're changing their messaging to take advantage of.
Absolutely. I'm so sorry. Yes, you're absolutely right. Yeah, I haven't thought about that. Yes, manipulation is, we're not using this word to say that this is illegal or cheating. No, not at all. It's just like a message. They are just kind of using the migration to kind of send or increase the beliefs that people have about the effects that a left-wing government could have. But you're right. We have to think of a better name. I haven't thought about that. That manipulation could be misunderstood. All right. So these are things these are just a few of the banners that we found online, but this is widely publicized all across Colombia in the last presidential elections. And then another thing that I wanted to show you was, is it true that maybe the majority of voters in Colombia have these fears? Because maybe it's just a minority, or maybe they see the banners that they don't believe it. But here I'm just showing you more, let's say, anecdotal or maybe some evidence of the fact that there is a large majority of Colombians who actually think this is true. So Invaders is a statistical firm, a firm that collects surveys in Colombia, and they do a survey that is representative of the majority of Colombian voters, 96% of the voters. It's not representative at the municipal level, and this is why we can't use it to run a statistical analysis, but at least we can kind of try to see, using the data that is collected there, to answer this question. Is it true that many Colombians think this is true? So the question that this firm asked was, Colombia might be in the same situation as Venezuela in the near future. Do you think that's true? Yes or no? And you can see that the green line is going to show you the share of respondents who actually thought this was a possibility, that Colombia might become Venezuela. Yeah.
So Sandra, sorry, let me make along the same lines a bit more of a substantive point here, right?
Yes.
So it could be that people have these beliefs. It could even be that the beliefs are correct. Who knows, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That there's a certain type of person coming and their politics come with them, right? Now, if regardless of whether the beliefs are correct, if the voters have the beliefs, then you would see that it might be actually sensible in a political equilibrium for one of the parties, or maybe even both of the parties, right, to speak to those voters and adjust their messaging and targeting strategy in order to tell the voters, tell the voters what they already believe, right? So, for example, Fox News does a great job of cornering the market because, people, not because Fox News is making people believe something, but because people already believe that, and they're happy to hear from someone what they already believe innately, right? Same thing with CNN on the left. And so I think it's going to be, when you talk about it as a mechanism, right? I think it's going to be really hard here to ever disentangle, the chicken and the egg problem, right? Is it that voters believe this and politicians are responding, or is it that politicians are taking advantage of this and making the voters believe it? It's just a really difficult problem to solve.
No, yeah, I totally agree with you. They probably go hand in hand. What is very interesting, however, is that this has never happened before. Like it seems like they appear at the same time. This messaging and the fears of Colombians become Venezuela. Well, yeah, you're right, absolutely right. I totally agree with you, and I think that's something that we need to tread very carefully in our analysis about. Thank you, Mushfiq. So,
will you be able to tell us anything? I'm sorry to interrupt, Sandra.
Yeah.
Will you be able to tell us anything about the left? Is the left doing any messaging along these lines? Are they responding in some strategic
silent.
way?
Well, from what we've learned, mostly silent about this. So basically, we just say, no, that's not true, that's not true, that's not true. That's about it. There's not really any messaging concerning migration, either pro-migration or anti-immigration from the left in Colombia.
Okay, interesting.
They basically don't talk about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so one thing that because we don't have perception, let's say, or political attitudes data at the municipal level, one thing we did was, well, what if we could find some measure that could kind of allow us to have a proxy for how sensible or how much each municipality has been impacted by the left in the past. So you might not know this, but Colombia was a country that had, before the Venezuelan migration, had a very strong internal conflict. And let's say that the beginning of this conflict was created by a leftist group that was trying to spark socialist sentiments in the country. And so oftentimes when you talk to people, what you see in Colombia is that the armed conflict presence is kind of viewed as the presence of the left in many of these regions in Colombia. But of course, later on in the process, that's something that I need to be very upfront about. Other groups appeared, which were related with the right, but originally this conflict was sparked by a leftist group. So what we do in this exercise is we try to evaluate whether there are heterogeneous effects on voting behaviors for those municipalities where the armed groups had a very strong past presence. So what we do is we create a dummy that is equal to 1 if there was a very strong presence of armed groups in that municipality. And what we see is basically that those municipalities are going to have disproportionate impacts of Venezuelan inflows in the expected direction, basically reducing support towards the left and increasing it towards the right. And another exercise, which is very related to this one, we tried to clean for the type of group. So there are many different armed groups in Colombia, and the one who is mostly associated with the left is FARC. And so what we did here is basically we created a dummy to see whether those municipalities that had a very intense FARC presence or where there was more FARC attacks, if we see that those have disproportionate impacts of voting behaviors when Venezuelans arrived. And again, we see very, very strong effect for those municipalities. Again, moving in the same direction, larger voter turnout and a recomposition of votes from the left to the right. So although we cannot prove that this is what is going on here, what we can say is there seems to be a very high correlation that these behaviors are driven by municipalities that have experienced firsthand what could happen when the left goes wrong. And so it could be that in these same municipalities, the fears are very strong about the effects that the left could have in Colombia. So to kind of wrap up my presentation, what we observe here is that the large migration inflows from Venezuela have had a very strong effect on voting behaviors. Specifically, we observe more voters turnout and a recomposition of votes from left to right. We argue in our paper and in this presentation that there's no support for the cultural hypothesis, saying we don't see a very strong case for the fact that there is a resentment towards Venezuelans from Colombians. But we do see some evidence or some correlations that these effects might be very related with the effects that the migration has had on labor outcomes or the fears that that Colombia might become a Venezuela if they support the left. But again, I think Mushfiq's points is very valid as to we can't really disentangle which is the chicken and the egg. There might be things that happen at the same time and are very, very strongly correlated. Thank you very much.
I think there was like, I think more than a question. What we have is that they said that one of the participants is saying that there is a paper by Campante and other authors showing that politicians use the anti-immigration discourse in the Ebola outbreak context. And they call it strategic behavior. On that, I don't know if you're...
Super interesting. Yeah, I can see how the fears of contagion could also be used as an anti-immigration argument. Yeah.
There is, yes, go ahead. There is an...
Hi, so my question is, the analysis covers a pretty long period. I'm wondering have you checked if results are different when you restrict to migration, before the current crisis and migration after 2015, when the political discourse may be quite different surrounding immigration?
Thank you, Jeremy. That's a great question. So we tried to do that, but unfortunately, it's not possible because the let's say the discourse from the right wing parties as to the what we call the electoral manipulation coincide very, very dramatically with the increase in Venezuelan inflows in Colombia. So when we restrict our sample period before 2016, which is where this discourse did not exist in Colombia, Venezuelan migration was negligible. So we're not able to really identify any effects. So we lose a lot of power, in other words, a lot of variation in the effects that this might be causing.
Okay, so the results are basically similar if you were to just focus on the 2015 and 2018 election.
If we kind of focus on the last period, the results are very low. But when you lose the results is when you move towards the past, when right. Venezuelan migration was not as strong.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Peter?
Yes. I'd like to make a comment on the beginning and the end of your talk.
Thank you.
We started with the world, and in a generic way, we ended up with a great focus on 2 South American countries with cross-border effects. Mm-hmm. Now, can we go back to the world?
Yeah.
How would you go back to the world now? We see this everywhere. Mm-hmm. What's happening? What's common everywhere? And is there something to be brought up from a comparison for the future? What's happening in the world? Is it populism? Is it globalism? Is it, what are people looking for? And can your analysis and your methodology help thinking leaders to help their peoples think? Now we're talking to the world now. Remember, after World War II, the terrible effects in Europe of the global wars, it created a certain determination on a global level so that refugee status is available to anybody in the world who's in danger of death in his own country. This is very important. Where do we go from here?
Yeah. Thank you, Peter. A great question. So I think the original motivation of our paper was to try to see whether the findings that you had on developing countries were translated in a poor country or in a country that has suffered more dramatic inflows. And what we do see, which is similar across the world, is that you see that is true also for this context, that whenever there is a large migration flow, voting behavior shift in a way that they support more the right and less the left. And you will see also that you see the same behaviors in the northern countries. But what is very different is that these behaviors are not, or we argue, are not predominantly driven by anti-immigration behaviors, but more for fears of becoming the epicenter of crises like the ones they are observing. And you would think that this is only common about, for example, Latin America, but in fact, no. If you actually check what happened in the last presidential elections in the US, there was a couple of very good articles in the New York Times recently kind of saying or suggesting that a similar strategic behavior was used by the Trump administration to get the support of Latin voters in Florida. So this is not something that is only happening in Colombia and is unrelated with the rest of the world. This type of strategic behaviors could also be used in the northern countries to move Latin voters, which are very important to countries like the US, and that are, sometimes can shift the outcomes of an election. And so in that sense, it would be worth exploring how important it was in the US. I think that's actually a paper that I would like to write in the future, to try to see whether that was important for determining the election outcomes in Florida.
Well, can I speak again?
Yeah.
After the Second World War in Europe, we had this whole idea of certain unification. But the most important thing was cultural and legal, because governments humbled themselves by allowing themselves to be taken to court by individuals. In Strasbourg, we have the European Court of Human Rights, which had great effects. Now, in the United Nations, the Commission on Human Rights is simply an observatory. There's no, people in Russia, it is said, naively used to think in the days of communism that you could take your governments to court of the United Nations. You can't. But it may be that this whole business of migration is really bringing us to a situation where the Universal Declaration of Human Rights needs to be supplemented by a new Universal Declaration of National Rights. This is a suggestion made by St. John Paul II in 1995 at the General Assembly. Now, you've got to think about this carefully, because you don't want dictators telling the rest of the world, don't interfere in what's happening in my country. Why see such dictators oppress people? So you'd have to have the Declaration of National Rights, Universal Declaration of National Rights, which in a way reflects Brexit and Trump in a way, and the whole populism everywhere. But then it needs to carry within itself the subjection to human rights at the United Nations level by citizens of your own country.
True,
that way
yeah.
we have balance.
Thank you, Peter. Super thankful for your comments. I definitely think that, but I agree with some of the things you're saying, but I think there are kind of different things to what we're kind of analyzing in this paper. All we wanted to do in this paper was to try to see what are the impacts that migration flows could have on voting behaviors in a developing country, and explore what could be driving those impacts. So I guess that the sort of more broad picture that you're asking about would be kind of subject to a different paper or probably a different analysis.
We have a question by Wagner Oliveira.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
So, Professor Sandra, it was really great presentation, very interesting paper. I was wondering about the mechanisms, specifically the socioeconomic ones that you showed. So I have two questions concerning that. The first one is concerned with the skill level of migrants, if you have any information on that, because I mean, there is some evidence for the United States, for example, that only low-skilled immigration led to voting for the right and not high-skilled migration, for example. So I was wondering if you have some information on on skills of migrants compared to natives. And the second one concerns the fiscal burden that you showed. Like, I think I saw that you showed both an effect on tax revenue and transfers.
Yeah.
Can you see if there is like some compensation between the two of them? I mean, what is the effect on the budget of like, is the government spending more relative to what it's getting more taxes, or can you see that kind of information?
Oh, thank you, Wagner. Both great questions. So on the scale, sorry. Yeah, okay. So on the scale question, there is two things that I would say. One is that, as I said earlier, I don't know if you recall, Venezuela was a very prosperous country, actually more so than Colombia. So it turns out that Venezuelans in general are more educated than Colombian nationals, to the order of 1 to 2 years of schooling. However, as you see in many other conflict situations or forced displacement situations, this is not conflict but humanitarian crisis, the original or the first migrants that we have in Colombia at the beginning of the humanitarian crisis are very educated and very wealthy. And as the crisis has progressed, we see more and more vulnerable. So it is, someone could very, very much argue correctly that the very last migrants could be less educated than Colombian nationals. But if you kind of take into consideration the whole picture of migrants, then on average, they are more educated. So it depends on when you kind of do the cut to measure that education level. And on the second question, we haven't done the net effect, but this is a great point, and I think a great suggestion to improve our paper. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much.
Yeah, we have a question by Martin.
Yeah, thank you. I was just thinking about the generalizability of the results. It seems like it's very key to this specific effect that it's a left-wing ideology country that people are fleeing from. And this seems similar to the situation in Florida with Cuban refugees there, but it seems very different from the kind of refugee flows that are coming into Europe or within Europe. And I was just interesting if there's, I was just thinking about the framing of the paper, if it's possible to separate out kind of types of refugee flows that are coming because of a kind of natural disaster, or at least where it doesn't have a clear ideological kind of connection, and refugee crises that are coming from a country where there is a very clear ideological kind of cause to the crisis. And also I would say that I would expect the effect to go in the opposite direction if it had been a right-wing dictatorship in Venezuela that caused people to flee. Like, according to the mechanism that you were pointing to, we should see the opposite.
True. Yeah, definitely. Great points. So of course this would be a different, more, I guess, cross-country analysis. But I definitely agree with you that this is very specific of the fact that the crisis was brought by a left-wing government, and again the same with Florida with the Cuban regime. It would be very interesting, I think, to do another research to see exactly that, whether depending on the ideology that begins the crisis, whether you see that the recipients of those migration flows resent that party, that specific, political orientation. And I guess that a great idea, as you pointed out, would be a placebo testing for natural disasters and see whether that drives any behaviors. So yeah, I would be happy to write a paper with you about that. It sounds like a wonderful idea.
Any more questions?
I have one more quick question. So I know in some previous work, you've also done work with internal migration. And I'm wondering if that's still a part of this research, if you think there's something you can learn by comparing the effects of internal migration with the effects of international migration, because Colombia has had so much internal migration.
Yeah, Jeremy, that's a great question. Thank you. And yes, you're right. Actually, the very early versions of this paper compared both migration shocks. So we were trying to see whether the internal migration had a different impact on the Venezuelan migration, because they were both very large shocks. And very interestingly, we find that the internal migration had no effects on any of the political orientation or any voting outcomes in Colombia at all. Nothing towards the left or the right or the center. What made it very difficult for us to compare both situations is that they did not coincide in time. So they are not contemporaneous. So first we have the internal migration, and there was a political, environment, and then we have the Venezuelan migration, and both kind of take place in different time frames. And so comparing them is complicated because of that. But yeah, just to give you an idea of what we found when we tried to do that, we did not find any impacts.
That's interesting. Thanks.
And Sandra, so you were mentioning that at the beginning, what you see are inflows of people that are more educated. Does that have an effect on the results that you have? I mean, are you able to pick that up somehow?
I see. Yeah. So we unfortunately don't have the data to know where, for example, the more educated individuals are. So unfortunately, Colombia doesn't have a very good tracking system to know where the Venezuelans are, where is their or if there is like a stratification of location by education levels in the country. What I think most commonly happens is that they tend to move to enclaves. So wherever there is a very large settlement of Venezuelans, they will move there, like the low educated and the highly educated. So it's really hard to tease out then whether those locations have differential effects of both types of migrants. But I know that there is a large literature suggesting that the the migrants that have low education levels tend to be direct substitutes for low income individuals, and that creates sometimes more resentment towards migrants. And there is also kind of mixed evidence on the fact of what are the impacts that highly educated migrants could have on political views. So when they bring money, people tend to like them. And when they bring, new firms, new ideas, new assets, people tend to like them. But sometimes still they resent cultural differences. And this is kind of what I remember of the literature.
Okay. The other question, sorry, is that you mentioned about the unemployment. So are the Venezuelan also including this informal in the measures that you have of informal work?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Do they have the permit to work, which is not normally the case for other countries?
True. So the special case about the developing countries is that, or the southern countries of the world, is that many of them have very large informal sectors. And it is true that in the period that we examine, not all of the Venezuelans have job permits. So in our analysis, we're only kind of focusing on the impacts on natives. So we only take into account Colombian nationals. But in general, Venezuelans, even if they don't have work permits, they might be working still in the informal sector. The informal sector is huge in Colombia, like almost 40% of the economy. And this is true for all of developed countries. And so as such, even if the government is restricting their entry to the economy, they will be very part of it, a very, very active part of it. They might not be able to enter the formal sector. That's the only part where the government might have some control. But our analysis kind of cleans them from the data. There is some housing labor surveys directed to Venezuelans, but we are able to identify them in the survey, so we can take them out.
Sorry. Apart from the academic aspect of your paper, which seems very, very admirable, I'm wondering if there's a drive, there's an objective beyond science in terms of influence or culture, because I think the science isn't just for the sake of the science. It has to be for the sake of change and progress. I'm wondering, where do you go from this kind of analysis?
Right. I guess our main drivers, of course, beyond contribute to science, is to kind of, by offering or trying to understand how migrants impact behaviors, you may be able to presumably at least bring an alert to strategic behaviors that might not be well-intentioned, or that might be happening that people are not aware of. and I think that's as much as I could say in that direction right now. Like I think informing and finding what are the effects that migration can have in a country and in views, in political attitudes. It facilitates trying to integrate migrants, trying to help them, be part of a society, and also kind of prevents or brings an alarm onto what type of behaviors are happening that might prevent those things from happening. But of course, that's something that we are not trying to do with this paper. This is just a purely academic paper, just informing of what are the impacts. But that could be the motivation for us as a researcher to move this agenda forward.
Yeah. Good.
Thank you.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Rozo. And I think if you...
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk.
A pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation.